The letter arrived sealed in black wax, and Alara Voss knew before she broke the seal that her life had just ended. She was 23 years old, standing in the marble receiving hall of Voss Manor, in a gown the color of spilled wine, and her father was watching her read it with the flat, satisfied patience of a man who has finally won an argument he started years ago. Lord Cassian Voss did not raise his voice. He never needed to. He simply waited, hands folded behind his back, while his daughter's fingers went white around the parchment. By decree of the Northern Council, and with the consent of House Voss, the Lady Alara Voss is hereby betrothed to Kale Draven, sovereign of the Ashmore territory, to be wed within the fortnight. Ashmore. The word landed like a stone dropped into still water. Everyone in the kingdom of Caldreth knew what Ashmore was now. Not a territory so much as a graveyard with a flag still flying over it. 6 years ago, it had been the wealthiest of the 6 Alpha holdings, its silver moon mines feeding half the continent's trade, its packlands thick with warriors who answered to a young, golden Alpha, the song still occasionally called the Lion of Ashmore. Then, in a single winter, it had all come apart. A sickness the healers never named swept through the packlands. The warriors who didn't die of it turned on each other, some said, driven mad by grief and rot. By spring, Ashmore's great hall stood empty, its silver mines flooded and sealed, and its Alpha, the same golden boy from the songs, was a widower, a man alone, ruling over ash and rumor. They called him the ruined king now. Some claimed he'd let his own people die rather than lose his crown. Others whispered he wasn't fully a man anymore, that whatever curse had gutted his territory had gutted something in him too. No noble family in 6 years had offered him so much as a trade envoy, let alone a bride. "You're sending me to a dead man's kingdom," Alara said. Her voice did not shake, which she was privately proud of, because everything else in her was shaking. "I'm sending you to your husband," Cassian corrected, and there, finally, was the smallest curl of satisfaction at the edge of his mouth. "You wanted to humiliate this family in front of the entire council. Congratulations. You've been granted a marriage worthy of the scene you made." The scene. That was what her father called it, 3 weeks ago. When Alara had stood up in the middle of the council's grain tribunal and announced, in front of 40 lords and their retinues, that the famine relief numbers Voss had submitted for the eastern villages were false, that grain meant for starving tenant families had been quietly rerouted and sold, and that she had the ledgers to prove it. She had not done it for spite. She had done it because she'd spent that autumn walking those villages herself, holding the hands of mothers whose children's ribs showed through their shirts, and she could not stand in a warm hall afterward and watch her father accept a toast for his generosity. She hadn't expected to win. She had expected consequences. She had not expected this. "You could have disowned me," she said. "You could have sent me to a convent. You chose Ashmore because you want everyone watching to understand exactly what happens to daughters who embarrass you." "I chose Ashmore," Cassian said, stepping closer, dropping his voice to something almost gentle, which was somehow worse. "Because it solves 2 problems in one afternoon, and you are intelligent enough to see the second one yourself, if you stop feeling sorry for you long enough to think." She did think. And she hated that he was right. There was a second problem, and it had a name: the Ashmore mines. Silver moon ore didn't just fetch gold. It was the only known stone that could hold a binding ward, the kind used in every treaty seal, every prison collar, every ship's compass rose in 6 kingdoms. When Ashmore fell, the price of silver moon had tripled overnight, and the council's biggest importers, House Thorne foremost among them, had grown obscenely rich, supplying the shortfall from smaller, inferior northern veins. If Ashmore's mines were ever reopened, that fortune would evaporate. A marriage between House Voss and the ruined king, publicly framed as punishment, was the perfect insult with the perfect alibi. No one could accuse Cassian of currying favor with a broken king, even while his daughter sat inside Ashmore's walls with eyes and ears that would eventually report home everything worth knowing. "You're not marrying me off," Alara said slowly. "You're planting me." Her father didn't confirm it. He didn't need to. He simply reached out and, with 2 fingers, tucked a loose strand of dark hair behind her ear, the way he used to when she was small, and had scraped a knee, and said, "Try to survive him, Alara. I do still, despite everything, prefer you alive." The journey north took 9 days. Alara made it in a covered wagon with 2 Voss guards who spoke to her only when necessary, and a maid, Junie, who cried for the first 4 days, and then, somewhere around the crossing of the Ash River, simply stopped, as if she'd run out of tears and found something steadier underneath. A decision to be useful instead of afraid. Alara envied her that. The land changed as they went. Caldreth's gentle green hills gave way to sharper country, black rock threaded through with old silver seams that caught the light like veins of frost. Forests grown thick and quiet in the absence of the woodcutters who'd once worked them. They passed 2 villages that were not villages anymore, just chimney stacks standing over collapsed roofs, gardens gone to bramble. Junie crossed herself at the second one. The guards said nothing, but Alara noticed both of them touch the iron charms at their belts. The old ward against wolf sickness that most Southerners had stopped believing in generations ago. They're afraid, she realized. Grown men with swords, afraid of a kingdom of ghosts. Ashmore's keep, when it finally rose out of the tree line on the 9th evening, was not what she expected. She had pictured ruin, crumbling towers, black smoke, something out of the songs. Instead, she saw a fortress of dark stone standing whole and unbroken against a bruised orange sky, its walls in good repair, torches lit along the battlements in a pattern too deliberate to be neglect. Something in her chest, already braced for horror, stumbled over the wrongness of order where she'd expected collapse. The gates opened before the wagon reached them. No fanfare, no welcoming party of lords, because there were no lords left to send. Just a single figure waiting in the torchlit courtyard, and as the wagon rolled to a stop, Alara understood, with a strange cold drop in her stomach, that this was him. He was younger than the rumors made him sound. The songs about the ruined king had painted an old, broken man, hollowed out by grief. But the man standing in the courtyard could not have been more than 30. Tall, built like the warriors in her father's old war tapestries, shoulders that had clearly done real labor and not just held a scepter. His hair was dark gold, cropped short and practical, and his eyes, when they found hers through the wagon's open flap, were a pale gray-green that held absolutely none of the madness the rumors promised. What they held instead was something far more disarming, a tired, careful courtesy, the look of a man bracing for one more disappointment and too proud to show it. Lady Voss. His voice was low, rough at the edges, like it wasn't used often. "I imagine this isn't the wedding you dreamed of as a girl." It was such an oddly gentle thing to say, an acknowledgement of her humiliation rather than a demand for gratitude, that for a moment Alara didn't know how to answer. "No," she said finally, stepping down from the wagon without waiting for his hand, because she needed, in that moment, to prove to herself she could still stand on her own. "It isn't." Something flickered across his face. Not offense, closer to recognition, as if he'd expected exactly that answer, and respected her for giving it honestly instead of performing gratitude she didn't feel. "Good," Kale Draven said. "I'd rather start with the truth than a lie either of us has to maintain for years." He turned toward the keep's open doors, silver moon torch brackets glinting faintly along the walls in a pattern that, she would only understand much later, was not decoration at all. "Come inside, my lady. Ashmore isn't the grave your father's council believes it to be. but I won't insult you by pretending it isn't lonely." Behind her, one of the Voss guards muttered something to the other, too low for her to catch except for a single word, cursed. And Alara Voss walked through the gates of a dead man's kingdom wondering, for the first time since the black waxed letter arrived, whether the story everyone had told her about this man was the same story he'd have told about himself. She did not yet know that within the month, the answer to that question would upend everything she thought she understood about her own family and put both their lives on a blade's edge no ledger could account for. The wedding was small, fast, and entirely without joy. A council magistrate reciting the binding words in a chapel with more empty pews than filled ones, Kale's remaining household staff standing witness because there was no one else left to stand. Alara said her vows to a stranger in a room that smelled of dust and old candle wax, and when it was over, no one clapped. Kyle simply reached over, took her hand, and pressed something cold into her palm. A ring of dark silver moon, unpolished, plainly forged by a hand that valued function over beauty. "It's not what you're used to," he said quietly. "Neither am I anymore," she answered, and meant it more than she expected to. The first weeks taught her that Ashmore was not the wasteland her father's council believed, or claimed to believe. The keep itself was small but scrupulously maintained. No broken hinges, no leaking roofs, no rot. There were perhaps 40 people left inside its walls total, a fraction of what a territory this size should hold. But every one of them worked with the quiet, competent economy of people who had learned, the hard way, that idleness invited despair. An old healer named Bramwell ran the infirmary with herbs he grew himself. A one-armed former warrior named Doss trained what remained of the guard, 12 men, no more, at dawn each day in the frost-hardened yard. And Kale himself, she discovered within her first week, did not sit a throne so much as work. She found him more often in the stables, or bent over ledgers by candlelight than seated on any dais. "Where did everyone go?" she asked him once, over a dinner neither of them had much appetite for. "The songs say a sickness. The council says worse. What actually happened?" Kale was quiet long enough that she thought he wouldn't answer. Then, 6 years ago, in a single season, half my pack sickened, and the other half turned violent trying to save them. I lost my mate in the second week. I lost my father, my captains, half the children in the nursery. His jaw worked once. The healers I brought in from 3 kingdoms couldn't name the illness. It didn't behave like any wolf sickness on record. It moved too fast, killed too selectively. Always the strongest warriors first, always in a pattern that looked less like disease and more like... He stopped himself. "Like what?" "Like poison," he said finally. "But I've never been able to prove it. And a king who accuses his allies of murder without proof is a king who loses whatever's left." Alara sat with that for a long moment, turning her wine glass slowly. Something about the phrase "always the strongest warriors" first snagged in her memory like a hook-catching cloth, though she couldn't yet say why. Over the following weeks, she learned him in fragments, the way you learn a language. First the simple words, then the grammar underneath. She learned that he read at night because he slept badly, that he still visited the sealed Silver Moon mine shafts alone once a week, though he never said why, that he was scrupulously, almost painfully fair with the little his territory had left, giving the last of the autumn stores to Bramwell's infirmary before his own table. She learned that the servants who'd stayed did not stay out of obligation. 3 of them had turned down positions in wealthier southern courts to remain in Ashmore's ruin, and when she asked old Doss why, the one-armed warrior had simply said, "Because he's the only alpha I've ever served who asked what we needed before he asked what we owed him." No one in 6 years, she began to realize, had bothered to actually look at this man. The songs had turned him into a symbol, ruined king, cursed alpha, cautionary tale, and every court in Caldreth had simply accepted the symbol and moved on, never once asking who he actually was underneath it. It struck her, walking the frost-bitten kitchen garden one gray morning with Kyle silently at her side, that she had been sent here as a punishment built entirely on a lie no one had ever tested. "Why do you let them believe the worst of you?" she asked him. "The mad alpha stories. You could dispute them." "With what?" He crouched to examine a frost-killed row of winter greens, his hands surprisingly gentle in the dirt. "Every witness who could confirm what actually happened here is dead. Every record from that winter was either destroyed in the chaos or—" He paused. Or taken, he said, and there was something carefully controlled in his voice now. A door closing on a thought he wasn't ready to hand her yet. "My father's private ledgers. The mine assay records from that final autumn. Gone. The week after the sickness broke out. I always assumed a frightened clerk burned them out of superstition. I've since started to wonder." That night, alone in the chamber she still hadn't grown used to calling hers, Alara took out the small traveling desk she'd brought from home, and for the first time since arriving, opened the private notebook she'd kept hidden in the wagon's false floorboard the entire journey north. The same ledgers, copied in her own hand, that had gotten her exiled here in the first place. She had memorized enough of her father's trade correspondence over the years, filing papers as a dutiful daughter long before she understood what she was reading, that certain names surfaced now with an unpleasant clarity. House Thorne. Specifically, Lord Malric Thorne, head of the Northern Trade Council, whose fortune had tripled in the 6 years since Ashmore's fall, and who, she now remembered with a cold lurch, had personally handled the relief inventory for the sickened Ashmore territory during that final winter. A detail buried in a single line of a shipping manifest she'd copied 18 months ago for entirely unrelated reasons. Relief inventory, delivered directly into Ashmore by Thorne's own men in the exact weeks the sickness began. She stared at the line until the candle guttered low, a suspicion forming that she was not yet ready to speak aloud. Not to Kale, who had already lost everything once to a lie he couldn't disprove. And certainly not in a letter home, where her father's eyes would read it before hers ever reached its destination. The next morning, a rider arrived from the south, bearing House Voss colors, and Alara's stomach dropped before she even broke the seal, because she recognized the handwriting on the outer fold, not her father's, but Malric Thorne's own. And the letter, when she read it in private, contained a single line that turned her suspicion into cold certainty. "Trust that your new husband's remaining assets will be assessed fairly by the council, once a full accounting of the Ashmore mines can finally be conducted. With your assistance, of course, my lady." They hadn't sent her here merely to insult a broken king. They had sent her here to finish what they'd started 6 years ago, and they were counting on her to help them do it. Alara burned the letter that same night, watching Malric Thorne's elegant handwriting curl black and vanish in the grate, and understood with a clarity that frightened her that she had just made her first irreversible choice as Kale Draven's wife, rather than as Cassian Voss's daughter. There was no unburning it, no walking it back. But burning a letter didn't answer the harder question underneath it. What, exactly, had happened 6 years ago? And how deep did it go? She started carefully, the way she'd learned to read her father's ledgers as a girl, not asking direct questions that would alert anyone, but simply looking. Old Bramwell the healer, she discovered over several quiet afternoons in his herb-thick infirmary, had kept his own private records of that terrible final winter, separate from whatever official documents had vanished. He hadn't shown them to anyone in 6 years, he admitted, because Kale had asked him not to reopen the wound, and Bramwell had respected that, until Alara, sitting beside his fire with genuine grief in her face rather than performance, asked him gently what he remembered. "It didn't spread like sickness," the old man said, hands shaking slightly around his cup. "Sickness moves through the weak first, the old, the young, the already frail. This moved through the strongest warriors first, the Alpha's personal guard, his captains, one after another over 11 days, before it ever touched a child or an elder. I told him that at the time. I told the investigators the council sent up. No one wanted to hear it, because it didn't fit the word plague, and plague was a simpler story than the alternative. What's the alternative? Bramwell looked at her for a long moment, weighing something. There's an old compound, he said finally. Distilled from silverbane root, that mimics wasting sickness in wolf-blooded warriors specifically. It does nothing to an ordinary human, nothing to the weak-blooded, but it burns through a strong alpha bloodline like fire through dry grass. It's rare, expensive. Takes a trained hand to distill without killing the distiller too. I found trace residue of something like it in 3 of the bodies I was allowed to examine before the council ordered the remains burned for contagion control. I wrote it down. I was told very politely that grief does strange things to a man's judgment, and that I should let the matter rest. Told by whom? Alara wanted to ask, though she was fairly certain she already knew, and the name sat in her chest like a stone all the way back to her own chamber that night. She found Kale in the sealed mine's outer chamber 2 nights later. She'd followed him at a distance, the way she'd started doing more than she admitted even to herself, not out of suspicion anymore, but something closer to worry. He stood in the torchlight before the great iron doors that had been welded shut 6 years ago, one hand flat against the cold metal, and when she stepped into the light, he didn't startle, only sighed, as though he'd known she'd find him eventually, and had simply been waiting for it. "My father sealed these himself," he said, "the week before he died. Said something to me I didn't understand at the time. That the mines weren't the prize. They were the motive. And that whoever wanted Ashmore gutted wanted it gutted specifically, so the seams could be reopened later by someone else, under a friendlier flag." Alara's pulse quickened. "Someone else? You mean Thorne?" Kyle turned to look at her sharply. "How do you know that name?" She told him then. All of it. The shipping manifest from 18 months ago. The relief inventory delivered by Thorne's men in the exact weeks the deaths began. The letter that had arrived under council seal, implying she'd been sent north specifically to help assess Ashmore's mineral assets once its king was sufficiently discredited or dead. She told him about Bramwell's silverbane theory, about strong warriors dying first, about records burned in the chaos of a plague that behaved like nothing in any healer's book. She watched something in his face change as she spoke. Not shock, exactly. More like a wound reopening along a line he'd suspected but never had the evidence to trace. "Silverbane," he said quietly, almost to himself. "It grows wild in the southern marshes. Thorne holds trade rights to those marshes. He tripled his fortune the year your mines went dark," Alara said. "Every kingdom's silver moon shortage funneled straight through his warehouses. And my father." Her voice caught. "My father sent me here for punishment, but Thorne wrote to me directly, within a week of my arrival, asking for my help conducting a full accounting of your remaining assets. He wasn't punishing me alongside you. He was placing an asset inside your walls." Kale was silent for a long moment, and when he finally spoke, his voice had gone dangerously quiet. The practiced calm of a man holding something enormous very still, so it wouldn't break loose and consume him. "If what you're telling me is true, then the man responsible for slaughtering my pack has spent 6 years growing rich on the wreckage. And the Northern Council, including your father, has known enough to suspect it and said nothing, because the silence was profitable for everyone at that table." "Not everyone," Alara said. "Not me. Not anymore." He looked at her then with an expression she hadn't seen from him before. Not gratitude exactly, something raw. The look of a man who had spent 6 years assuming he'd have to carry every fight alone, and was only now realizing he might not have to. "Why would you throw away your family's protection for a kingdom you were sent to as an insult?" "Because I already threw it away once," she said. "Back home, over grain that went missing from starving villages while my father accepted toasts for his generosity. I didn't come to Ashmore as your enemy, Kale. I was sent here as a weapon aimed at you, but no one asked whether the weapon might decide to point somewhere else. It was Doss, the one-armed guard captain, who broke the fragile quiet of that decision 3 days later, arriving at the keep at a dead run with news that stole the color from Kale's face. A council delegation was riding north under Thorne's personal banner, 3 days out, carrying, by their own advance letter, full legal authority to assess and, if warranted, reallocate the Ashmore mineral holdings on the grounds that its sovereign had failed for 6 years to make productive use of a council-chartered resource. It was, Alara understood immediately, a legal seizure dressed up in the language of concern. And it would succeed, unless she and Kale could prove, in 3 days, what 6 years and a king's grief had failed to prove. That Malric Thorne had poisoned an entire pack to engineer exactly this outcome. 3 days, Kale said grimly, staring north toward the road the delegation would come riding down. 3 days to prove a 6-year-old murder, or lose the only thing my father died protecting. Alara thought of Bramwell's hidden notes, of the shipping manifest she'd memorized as a girl without understanding its weight, of a silver moon ring cold against her finger, and a marriage that had been engineered as a cruelty and had somehow become the truest alliance she'd ever stood inside. Then we don't have 3 days to grieve what was taken, she said. We have 3 days to make sure it's the last thing Thorne ever takes from anyone. They worked through the nights that followed, with the particular focused desperation of people who understood exactly what losing would cost. Bramwell's private notes, kept for 6 years out of quiet stubbornness, rather than any hope they'd matter, became the spine of the case. Detailed, dated observations of a wasting sickness that selectively killed the strongest warriors first, cross-referenced against symptoms no natural plague on record produced. Alara's memory of the shipping manifest gave them a second thread, a specific delivery, a specific date, Thorne's own seal on a relief shipment that arrived in Ashmore 11 days before the first warrior fell ill. 11 days being, Bramwell confirmed grimly, precisely the incubation window a slow-acting silverbane distillation would require. What they lacked was the physical proof that would hold up before a full council tribunal rather than dissolve, as it had 6 years ago, into the comfortable fog of grief, does strange things to a man's judgment. The sealed mine, Kale said, on the second sleepless night, staring at the notes spread across his father's old war table. My father didn't seal it to protect the ore. He sealed it because the last shipment of silver moon ingots never left the mine before the sickness hit. Thorne's men delivered the relief supplies the same week they were meant to collect that shipment. If something went wrong in the exchange, if there's any trace of what actually killed my people, it isn't in a burned ledger somewhere. It's still down there, behind those doors, exactly where my father left it. They broke the seal at dawn with Doss and 2 of the remaining guards standing watch. And what they found in the mine's collecting chamber, preserved by 6 years of cold, undisturbed dark, was worse and better than either of them had let themselves hope. 3 unopened crates stamped with House Thorne's own trademark, never collected, containing not silver moon at all but empty vials, dozens of them. Their residue analyzed within hours by a trembling but resolute Bramwell as unmistakably, chemically silverbane. And beneath the crates, wrapped in oiled cloth and clearly hidden in haste, Kale's father's private assay ledger, the one everyone had assumed burned. Its final entries written in a shaking hand that named Malric Thorne directly as the buyer negotiating, weeks before the sickness struck, to purchase Ashmore's mining rights below market value the moment its sovereign bloodline was, his father's own chilling phrase, sufficiently thinned. It was, Alara realized, staring at the evidence laid out under torchlight, not merely proof of murder. It was assigned motive, in the murderer's own trade seal, sitting untouched for 6 years because no one with power had ever bothered to look for it. Because the story everyone told about Ashmore was tragedy, not crime, and tragedies don't get investigated the way crimes do. The council delegation arrived the following afternoon, Malric Thorne riding at its head in robes the color of good silver moon ore, flanked by 2 junior council magistrates, and to Alara's genuine shock, her own father, Cassian Voss, present in his official capacity as a senior council voice. There, she understood immediately, to lend his name's weight to whatever reallocation Thorne intended to formalize, and to collect whatever intelligence his daughter had gathered in the process. "Lady Voss," Thorne said warmly, dismounting in Ashmore's courtyard, with the easy confidence of a man who has never once been made to answer for anything. "I trust your husband has been reasonable about today's proceedings." "Entirely reasonable," Kale said, stepping forward before Alara could answer, his voice carrying the calm, dangerous evenness of a man who has stopped performing weakness because he no longer needs to. "In fact, my wife and I have prepared quite a thorough accounting for the council, as requested. I think you'll find it exceeds expectations." What followed, in Ashmore's cold great hall before the assembled delegation, was not the humiliation Thorne had ridden north expecting to administer. Bramwell's medical notes were read into record first, dry and clinical and devastating. Then the assay ledger, in the elder Draven's own handwriting, naming Thorne as a buyer negotiating for a thinned bloodline weeks before the deaths began. Then the crates themselves, wheeled into the hall on Doss's order, House Thorne's trade seal stamped plainly on wood that had waited 6 years in the dark for exactly this moment, their emptied vials laid out in a row like a confession no lawyer could talk around. Alara watched her father's face throughout, and what she saw there was not surprise. It was the particular, sickened stillness of a man realizing, in real time, exactly how much he had chosen not to know for 6 comfortable years. And understanding. With the second junior magistrate already reaching for parchment to record a formal charge, that his own presence at this table implicated him in the silence, even if his hands had never touched the poison itself. Thorne, to his credit or his ruin, did not break cleanly. He argued provenance, chain of custody, the unreliability of a grieving healer's memory. But council law was old and specific about trade seals, and his own mark on murder weapons packaged as relief supplies was not a thing any argument could paraphrase away. Within the week, under a tribunal convened at the council's own capital, Malric Thorne would be stripped of his trade charter, his Silverbane operations seized, his fortune clawed back into a restitution fund for what remained of Ashmore's shattered pack. A fortune that could not resurrect the dead, but could, finally, rebuild what 6 years of engineered ruin had stolen from the living. Cassian Voss did not go untouched either. He kept his title, kept his lands, but lost his council seat within the season, his complicity in profitable silence judged, by his peers, unforgivable precisely because it had been so comfortable. He wrote to Alara once, months later, not an apology exactly. Cassian Voss was never built for those, but something adjacent to one, a grudging acknowledgement that the daughter he'd exiled as punishment had done, with more courage than he'd ever shown at that council table, exactly what he should have done himself years earlier. Alara stood at Ashmore's battlements the evening the delegation finally rode south, Kale beside her, the mine's iron doors standing open behind them for the first time in 6 years, silver moon veins glinting faintly in the last of the daylight, like something waking up rather than something dead. "They sent me here to end you," she said quietly. "Instead, I found the one person in 6 kingdoms who never once asked me to be anyone other than exactly who I was." Kale took her hand, the one wearing the plain, unpolished ring he'd given her in a chapel full of empty pews, and turned it gently in the fading light. "Everyone else looked at a ruined king and saw a story already finished," he said. "You were the only one who bothered to ask what actually happened. I don't think either of us was ever the punishment, Alara. I think we were just the 2 people everyone else stopped looking at closely enough to see." Below them, in the courtyard, Doss and Bramwell and the rest of Ashmore's small, stubborn household were already talking, not in the hushed, careful tones of people waiting for the next disaster, but in the loud, overlapping voices of people beginning, for the first time in 6 years, to plan. And somewhere south, in a council capital that would spend years untangling exactly how deep Thorne's Silverbane trade had reached, a new question was already taking root in every court that had once written Ashmore off as a cautionary tale. How many other ruined kingdoms, quietly inherited by conveniently profitable neighbors, had never actually been ruined by anything but a story no one had bothered to question? Ashmore's mines reopened within the month. Its king was no longer spoken of as broken, and the woman who had arrived as a punishment stayed on by her own choice, as something the old songs had never quite found the word for. Not a bride sent in humiliation, but a wife who had looked past every rumor to find the man underneath and decided he was worth staying for.